Book 4. Discussion of existing and possible variations of democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. Rule of the middle class as the best government under average conditions. Necessary branches of government, deliberative, assembly, executive offices, courts of law. Chapter 1. In all those arts and sciences that embrace the whole of any subject, and are not restricted to a part only, it is the province of each single art or science to consider all that appertains to its particular subject. For example, the art of gymnastics considers not only the suitableness of different modes of training to different bodies, but what sort is absolutely the best, for the absolutely best must suit the body that is by nature best, and best furnished with the means of life. And also what common form of training is adapted to the great majority of men. And if a man does not desire the best habit of body, or the greatest skill in gymnastics, which might be attained by him, still the trainer or teacher of gymnastic should be able to impart some lesser degree of either. The same principle holds equally in medicine or shipbuilding, or the making of clothes, or the arts generally. Hence, it is obvious that government too is the subject of a single science, which has to consider both what kind of government would be best and most in accordance with our aspirations, if there were no outer impediments, and also what kind of government is adapted to particular states, for the best is often unattainable, and therefore the true lawmaker or statesman ought to be acquainted not only with 1. That which is best in the abstract, but also with 2. That which is best considering the circumstances. We should be able further to say how a state may be constituted under any given conditions. 3. Both how it may be originally formed, and when formed, how long is preserved, when the supposed state is so far from the very best that it is without the conditions necessary for a good state, and is not even the best under the circumstances, but an inferior type. He ought, moreover, to know 4. The form of government best suited to states in general, for political writers, although they have excellent ideas, are often unpractical. We must consider, then, not only what form of government is best, but also what is possible and easily attainable by all. There are some who would have none but the most perfect, but for this many natural advantages are required. Others, again, speak of a more attainable form, and although they reject the constitution under which they are living, extol some other one in particular, for example, the Spartan. Any change of government which has to be introduced should be one which men are both willing and able to adopt, since there is quite as much trouble in the reformation of an old constitution as in the establishment of a new one, even as to unlearn is as hard as to learn, and therefore, in addition to the qualifications of the statesman already mentioned, he should be able to find remedies for the defects of existing constitutions. But this he cannot do unless he knows how many forms of government there are. It is often supposed that there is only one kind of democracy and one of oligarchy. But this is a mistake, so, in order to avoid such mistakes, we must ascertain what differences there are in the constitutions of states, and in how many ways they are combined. The same political insight will enable a man to know which laws are best, and which are best suited to different constitutions, for the laws are and ought to be adapted to the constitution, and not the constitution to the laws. A constitution is the organization of offices in a state. It determines what is to be the governing body, and what is the end of each community. The laws are not to be confounded with the principles of the Constitution. They are the rules according to which the magistrates should administer the state and proceed against offenders. So we must know the number and varieties of the several forms of government, if only with a view to making laws, for the same laws cannot be equally suited to all oligarchies or to all democracies, since there is certainly more than one form both of democracy and of oligarchy. Chapter 2. In our original discussion about governments, we divided them into three true forms: monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional government, and three corresponding perversions: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Of monarchy and of aristocracy we have already spoken, for the inquiry into the perfect state was the same as the discussion of the two forms thus named, since both rest on a principle of virtue provided with external instruments. We have already determined in what aristocracy and monarchy differ from one another, and when the latter should be established. In what follows we have to describe the so-called constitutional government, which bears the common name of all constitutions, and the other forms: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. It is obvious which of the three perversions is the worst, and which is the next in badness. That which is a perversion of the first and most divine government is necessarily the worst. And just as royal rule, if not a mere name, must exist by virtue of some great personal superiority in the king, so tyranny, which is the worst of governments, is necessarily the farthest removed from a well-constituted form. Oligarchy is a little better, but a longer way from aristocracy, and democracy is the most tolerable of the three. Not to pursue this question further at present, let us begin by determining 1. How many varieties of states there are, since of democracy and oligarchy there are several. 2. What constitution is the most generally acceptable, and what is preferable next after the perfect? What other aristocratic or well-constituted form of government there is, which is at the same time adapted to states in general? 3. To whom each of the other forms of government is best suited, for democracy may meet the needs of some better than oligarchy, and conversely. In the next place, 4. We have to consider in what manner a man ought to go about establishing some one among these various forms of democracy or oligarchy. And lastly, 5. Having briefly discussed these subjects to the best of our power, we will endeavor to ascertain the sources of the ruin or the preservation of states, both generally and in individual cases, and to what causes they are to be attributed. Chapter 3. The reason why there are many forms of government is that every state contains many elements. In the first place, we see that all states are made up of families. Then in the multitude of citizens, there must be some rich and some poor, and some in a middle condition. The rich, too, are heavy-armed, and the poor not. Among the common people some are farmers, and some traders, and some artisans. Among the upper class also there are differences of wealth and property. For example, in the number of horses which they keep, for they cannot afford to keep them unless they are rich. Therefore, in old times, the cities whose strength lay in their cavalry were oligarchies. They used cavalry in wars against their neighbors, as was the practice of Eretrians and Chalcidians, and also of the Magnesians of the on the river Maeander, and other people in Asia. Besides differences of wealth, there are differences of rank and merit. There are also other elements which we mentioned when treating of aristocracy and in enumerating the essentials of a state. Of these elements, sometimes all, sometimes the lesser and sometimes the greater number, have a share in the government. It is evident then that there must be many forms of government, differing in kind, since the parts of which they are composed differ from each other in kind. For a constitution is an organization of offices which the citizens all distribute among themselves, according to the power which the different classes possess, as for example the rich or the poor, or by some principle of equality both. There must therefore be as many forms of government as there are modes of arranging the offices, according to the superiorities and the differences in parts of the state. There are generally thought to be two principal forms, as men say of the winds that there are but two, north and south, and that the rest are only variations of these. So of governments they say there are only two forms, democracy and oligarchy. For aristocracy is considered to be a kind of oligarchy, being the rule of a few, and the so-called constitutional government really a democracy. Just as among the winds we make the west a variation of the north wind, and the east of the south. Similarly, of modes in music there are said to be two, the Dorian and the Phrygian, or Phrygian. The other arrangements of the scale are comprehended under one or other of these two. About forms of government, this is a very favorite notion. But in either case, the better and more exact way is to distinguish, as I have done, the one or two true forms, and to regard the others as perversions, either of the most perfectly attempered mode or of the best form of government. We may compare the oligarchic forms to the severe and more empowering modes, and the democratic to the more relaxed and gentler ones. Chapter 4. It must not be assumed, as some are fond of saying, that democracy is simply that form of government in which the greater number are sovereign. For in oligarchies, and indeed in every government, the majority rules. Nor again is oligarchy that form of government in which a few are sovereign. Suppose the whole population of a city to be 1,300, and of these 1,000 are rich, who do not allow the remaining 300 who are poor, but free, and in all other respects their equals, a share of the government. No one will say that this is a democracy. In like manner, if the poor were few, and masters of the rich who outnumbered them, no one would ever call such a government in which the rich majority had no share of office an oligarchy. Therefore, we should rather say that democracy is a form of government in which the free are rulers, and oligarchy one in which the rich rule. It is only an accident that the free are the many, and the rich are the few. Otherwise, a government in which offices were assigned according to stature, as is said to be the case in Ethiopia, or according to beauty, would be an oligarchy, for the number of tall or of good-looking men is small. Still, oligarchy and democracy are not sufficiently distinguished merely by these two characteristics of wealth and freedom. Both of them contain many other elements. Therefore, we must carry our analysis further, and say that a government is not a democracy in which free men, who are few in number, rule over many who are not free, as at Apollonia at the Ionian Gulf, and at Thera. In each of these states, the nobles, who were also the earliest settlers, were held in chief honor, although they were but few out of many. Neither is it a democracy when the rich have the government and exceed in numbers, as was the case formerly at Colophon, where the bulk of the inhabitants were possessed of large property before the Lydian War. But a government is a democracy when the free, who are also poor, and a majority, govern, and an oligarchy when the rich and the noble govern, and are at the same time few in number. I have said there are many forms of government, and have explained to what cause the variety is due, why there are more than those already mentioned, and what they are, and whence they arise. I will now proceed to consider, starting from the principle already admitted, that every state consists not of one but of many parts. If we were going to speak of the different species of animals, we should first of all find the organs that are indispensable to every animal, as for example organs of sense, and of receiving and digesting food, such as the mouth and the stomach, also organs of locomotion. Assuming now that there are only so many kinds of organs, but that there may be differences in them, I mean different kinds of mouths and stomachs and perceptive and locomotive organs, the possible combinations of these differences will necessarily furnish many varieties of animals, for animals cannot be the same which have different kinds of mouths or of ears, and when all the combinations are exhausted, there will be as many sorts of animals as there are combinations of the necessary organs. So with the forms of government which have been described, states, as I have repeatedly said, are composed not of one but of many elements. One element is the food-producing class, who are called farmers. A second, the class of craftsmen, who practice the arts without which a city cannot exist. Some of them are absolutely necessary, others contribute to luxury or to the grace of life. The third class is that of traders, and by traders I mean those who are engaged in buying and selling, either in commerce or retail trade. A fourth in class is that of serfs or laborers. The soldiers make up the fifth class, and they are as necessary as any of the others. If the country is not to be the slave of every invader, for how can a state which has any title to the name be of a slavish nature? Then, as the soul may be said to be more truly part of an animal than the body, so the higher parts of the state, that is to say, the warrior class, and the class engaged in the administration of justice and in deliberation, which is the special business of political intelligence. These are even more essential to the state than the parts which minister to the necessaries of life. There are also the wealthy who minister to the state with their property. These form a seventh class. The eighth class is that of magistrates and officers, for the state cannot exist without rulers, and therefore some must be able to take office and to serve the state, either always or in turn. Different functions can be combined often in the same individual. For example, the warrior may also be a farmer or an artisan, and the counselor a judge. All claim to possess political ability and think that they are quite competent to fill most offices, but the same persons cannot be both rich and poor at the same time. For this reason, the rich and the poor are regarded in a special sense as parts of the state. Again, because the rich are generally few in number while the poor are many, they appear to be antagonistic, and as the one or the other prevails, they form the government. Hence arises the common opinion that there are but two kinds of government, democracy and oligarchy. I have already explained that there are many differences in constitutions, and to what causes the variety is due. Let me now show that there are different forms of both democracy and oligarchy, as will indeed be evident from what has preceded. For within both the common people and the notables there are various classes. Within the common people, one class are farmers, another artisans, another traders, employed in buying and selling. Another are the seafaring class, engaged either in war or in trade, as ferrymen or fishermen. In many places, some one of these classes forms quite a large population, as for example the fishermen at Tarentum and Byzantium, the crews of triremes at Athens, the merchant seamen at Aegina and Chios, the ferrymen at Tenedos. To the classes already mentioned may be added the day laborers, and those who, owing to needy circumstances, have no leisure, and those who are not of free birth on both sides, and there may be other classes as well. The notables, again, may be divided up according to their wealth, birth, virtue, education, and similar differences. Of the forms of democracy, first comes that which is said to be based strictly on equality. In such a democracy, the law calls it justice that the poor should have no more power than the rich, and that neither should be masters, but both equal. For if liberty and equality, as is thought by some, are the chief characteristics of democracy, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. And since the people are the majority, and the opinion of the majority is decisive, such a government must necessarily be a democracy. There is another in which the magistrates are elected according to a certain property qualification, but a low one. He who has the required amount of property has a share in the government, but he who loses his property loses his rights. Another kind is that in which all citizens who are not disqualified share in the government, and still the law is supreme. In another, everybody who is only a citizen is admitted to the government, and the law is supreme as before. A fifth form of democracy, in other respects the same, is that in which not the law but the multitude have supreme power, and supersede the law by their decrees. This state of affairs is brought about by demagogues. For in democracies which are subject to law, the best citizens hold the first place, and there are no demagogues. But where the laws are not supreme, there demagogues spring up. The people become the monarch, and is many in one, and the many have the power in their hands, not as individuals but collectively. Homer says, "It is not good to have a rule of the many." Though whether he means this corporate rule or the rule of many individuals is uncertain, and the people now being the monarch and no longer under the control of law seeks to exercise monarchical sway and grows into a despot. The flatterer is held in honor. This sort of democracy is relatively to the other democracies what tyranny is to other forms of monarchy. The spirit of both is the same, and they alike exercise a despotic rule over the better citizens. The decrees of the populace correspond to the edicts of the tyrants, and the demagogue is to the one what the flatterer is to the other. Both have great power, the flatterer with the tyrant, the demagogue with democracies of the kind we are describing. The demagogues make the decrees of the people override the laws by referring all things to the popular assembly, and therefore they grow great. Because the people have all things in their power, and the demagogues hold in their hands the votes of the people who are too ready to listen to them. Further, those who have any complaint to bring against the magistrates say, "Let the people be judges." The people are too happy to accept the invitation, and so the authority of every office is undermined. Such a democracy is fairly open to the objection that it is not a constitution at all. For where laws have no authority, there is no constitution. Under a constitution, the law must be supreme over all, and the magistrates judge only of particular cases, so that if democracy be a real form of government, the sort of system in which all things are regulated by popular decrees is clearly not a democracy in the true sense of the word, for decrees relate only to particulars. These, then, are the different kinds of democracy. Among oligarchies, too, there are different kinds. In one, the property qualification for any office is so high that the poor, although they form the majority, they have no share in government. Yet he who acquires the qualification may then get a share. Another sort is when there is a qualification for office, and a high one, and vacancies in the governing body are filled through elections by that body. If the candidate is chosen from all qualified persons, a constitution of this kind inclines to an aristocracy. If only from a privileged class to an oligarchy. Another sort of oligarchy is when son succeeds father. There is a fourth form, likewise hereditary, in which the magistrates are supreme and not the law. Among oligarchies, this is what tyranny is among monarchies, and the last named form of democracy among democracies. In fact, this sort of oligarchy is called dynastic, or rule of powerful families. These are the only different sorts of oligarchies and democracies. It should, however, be remembered that in many states the constitution which is established by law, although not democratic owing to the education and habits of the people, may be administered democratically. Conversely, in other states, the established constitution may incline to democracy, but may be administered in an oligarchical spirit. This most often happens after a revolution, for governments do not change at once. At first, the dominant party are content with encroaching gradually upon their opponents. The laws which existed previously continue in force, but the authors of the revolution have the actual power in their hands. Chapter 6. From what has been already said, we may surely infer that there are many different kinds of democracies and of oligarchies, for it is evident that sometimes all the classes mentioned must share in the government, and again some only and not others. When the class of farmers and those of moderate means have the supreme power, the government is administered according to law, for the citizens, being compelled to live by their labor, have no leisure. So they set up the authority of the law and attend assemblies only when necessary. They all obtain a share in the government when they have acquired the qualification fixed by the law, and nobody is excluded. The absolute exclusion of any class would be a step towards oligarchy, but leisure cannot be provided for them unless there are revenues to support them. This is one sort of democracy, and these are the causes which give birth to it. Another kind is based on a principle of election, which naturally comes next in order. In this, everyone to whose birth there is no objection is a citizen and shares in the government, if he can find time. In such a democracy, the supreme power is vested in the laws, because the state has no means of paying the citizens. A third kind is when all freemen have a right to share in the government, but do not actually share, for the reason which has already been given, so that in this form, again, the law must rule. A fourth kind of democracy is that which comes latest in the history of states. In our own day, when cities have far outgrown their original size and revenues have increased, all citizens have a place in the government. Though the great preponderance of the masses, they all too, including the poor who receive pay and therefore have leisure to exercise their rights, share in the administration. Indeed, when they are paid, the common people have the most leisure, for they are not hindered by the care of property, which often fetters the rich, who are thereby prevented from taking part in the assembly or in the courts. In this way, the state is governed by the poor, who are a majority, and not by the laws. So many kinds of democracies there are, and they grow out of these necessary causes. Of oligarchies, one form is that in which the majority of citizens have some property, though not very much. This first form allows to anyone who obtains the required amount the right of sharing in the government. The sharers in the government being a numerous body, it follows that the law must govern and not individuals, for in proportion as they are further removed from a monarchical form of government, and have neither so much property as to be able to live without attending to business, nor so little as to need state support, they must admit the rule of law, and not claim to rule themselves. But if the men of property in the state are fewer than in this first case, and own more property, there arises the second form of oligarchy. For the stronger they are, the more power they claim. And having this object in view, they themselves select those of the other classes who are to be admitted to the government, but not being as yet strong enough to rule without law, they make the law represent their wishes. When this power is intensified by a further diminution of their numbers and an increase of their property, there arises the third and further stage of oligarchy, in which the governing class keep the offices in their own hands, and the law ordains that son shall succeed father. When finally the rulers have great wealth and numerous friends, this sort of dynastic despotism approaches a monarchy. Individuals rule and not the law. This is the fourth kind of oligarchy, and is analogous to the last sort of democracy. Chapter 7. There are, however, still two forms besides democracy and oligarchy. One of them is universally recognized and included among the four principal forms of government, which are said to be 1. Monarchy, 2. Oligarchy, 3. Democracy, and 4. The so-called aristocracy or government of the best. But there is also a fifth, which keeps the generic name of commonwealth or constitutional government. This is not common, and therefore has been noticed by writers who attempt to enumerate the different kinds of government, like Plato in his books about the state. They recognize only 4. Chapter 8. I have yet to speak of this so-called commonwealth and of tyranny. I put them in this order, not because a commonwealth or constitutional government is to be regarded as a perversion any more than the above-mentioned aristocracies. The truth is that they all fall short of the most perfect form of government, and so are reckoned among perversions. But the really perverted forms are perversions of these, as I said before. Last of all, I will speak of tyranny, which I place last in the series because I am examining the constitutions of states, and this is the very reverse of a constitution. Having explained why I have adopted this order, I will proceed to consider constitutional government, the nature of which will be clearer now that oligarchy and democracy have been defined. For a constitutional government may be described generally as a fusion of oligarchy and democracy. Though the name is usually applied to those forms of government which incline towards democracy, and the name aristocracy to those which incline towards oligarchy, because birth and education are usually accompaniments of wealth, the rich too possess the material advantages the want of which is a temptation to crime, and hence are called noblemen and gentlemen. So, as aristocracy seeks to give predominance to the best citizens, people say also of oligarchies that they are composed of noblemen and gentlemen. Now, it appears impossible that a state which is governed by its best citizens should be ill-governed, and equally impossible that a state which is governed by its worst should be well-governed. But we must remember that good laws, if they are not obeyed, do not alone constitute good government, for there are two parts of a good government. One is first the actual obedience of citizens to the laws, the other is the goodness of the laws by which they obey. They may obey bad laws as well as good, and a further distinction is possible. They may obey either the best laws attainable to them, or the best absolutely. The distribution of offices according to merit is a special characteristic of aristocracy. For virtue is the principle of an aristocracy, as wealth is of an oligarchy, and freedom of a democracy. In all of them there of course exists the right of the majority. Whatever seems good to the majority of those who share in the government has authority. Generally, however, in a state of this kind there is a constitutional government, not an aristocracy. For the fusion goes no further than an attempt to unite the freedom of the poor and the wealth of the rich, who commonly take the place of the noble. Now there are three grounds on which men claim an equal share in the government: freedom, wealth, virtue. For the fourth is good birth, is the result of the two last, being only ancient wealth and virtue. It is clear that in a mixture of two elements, that is to say, of the free and the wealthy, is a commonwealth or constitutional government, and a union of all three an aristocracy or government of the best. And more than any other form of government except the true and ideal, it has a right to this name. Thus far I have described the different forms of states which exist besides monarchy, democracy, and oligarchy, and what they are, and in what aristocracies differ from one another, and commonwealths from aristocracies. That the two latter are not very unlike is obvious. Chapter 9. Next we have to consider how by the side of oligarchy and democracy the so-called commonwealth or constitutional government springs up, and how it should be organized. The nature of it will be at once understood from a comparison of oligarchy and democracy. We must ascertain their different characteristics, and taking a portion from each, put the two together, like the parts of an indenture. Now there are three methods by which fusions of government may be effected. In the first method, they combine the laws made by both governments, regarding, say, the administration of justice. In oligarchies, they impose a fine on the rich if they do not serve on juries, and give no pay to the poor. But in democracies, they give pay to the poor and do not fine the rich. Now, a union of these two practices is a common or middle term between them, and is therefore characteristic of a constitutional government, for it is a combination of both. That is, one method of uniting the two, or two, a mean may be taken between the statutes of the two. Thus, democracies require no property qualification for members of the assembly, or only a small one. Oligarchies, a high one. Here, the common term is neither of these, but a mean between them. By a third method, something is borrowed from the oligarchic, and something from the democratic principle. For example, the appointment of magistrates by law is democratic, and the election of them oligarchic. The absence of a property qualification is democratic. The presence of one, however, is oligarchic. In the constitutional state, one feature will be taken from each. From oligarchy, the rule of election to office. From democracy, the disregard of property qualification. Such are the various methods of combination. In a true union of oligarchy and democracy, the same state may be termed either a democracy or an oligarchy. Those who use both names evidently feel that the fusion is complete. Such a fusion there is in a mean, for both extremes appear in it. The Spartan constitution, for example, is often described as a democracy, because it has many democratic features. In the first place, the youth receive a democratic education, for the sons of the poor are brought up with the sons of the rich, who are educated in such a manner as to make it possible for the sons of the poor to be educated like them. A similar equality prevails in the following period of life, for when the citizens are grown up to manhood, the same rule is observed. There is no distinction between rich and poor. In like manner, they have all the same food at their public tables, and the rich wear only such clothing as any poor man can afford. Again, the people elect to one of the two greatest offices of state, and in the other they share, for they elect the senators and share in the ephoralty. Yet by other persons the Spartan constitution is called an oligarchy, because it has many oligarchic elements. All offices are filled by election and none by lot, which is one of the oligarchic characteristics. The power of inflicting death or banishment rests with a few persons, which is another, and there are others. In a well-balanced commonwealth, there should appear to be both elements and yet neither. The government too should rely on itself and not on foreign aid, nor on the goodwill of a large number of foreign states. They might be equally well disposed to a vicious form of government, but on the general willingness of all classes within the state to maintain the constitution. Enough of the manner in which a constitutional government and in which the so-called aristocracies ought to be framed. Chapter 10. Of the nature of tyranny I have still to speak, that it may have its place in our inquiry, since even tyranny we reckon a form of government. Although there is not much to be said about it already in the former part of this treatise, I have discussed monarchy or kingship according to the most usual meaning of the term, and considered whether it is or is not advantageous to states, and what kind of monarchy should be established, and whence and how. When speaking of monarchy, we spoke also of two forms of tyranny, which are both legal and therefore easily pass into kingship. Among barbarians, there are elected monarchs who exercise a despotic power. Despotic rulers were also elected in ancient Hellas, called dictators. These autocracies, when compared with one another, exhibit certain differences, and they are, as I said before, royal, insofar as the autocrat rules according to law and over willing subjects, but they are tyrannical insofar as he is despotic and rules according to his own fancy. There is also a third kind of tyranny, which is the most typical form, and is the opposite of the perfect monarchy. This tyranny is just that arbitrary power of an individual which is responsible to no one, and governs all alike, both equals and betters, with a view to its own advantage, not to that of its subjects, and therefore against their will. No free man, if he can escape from it, will endure such a government. The kinds of tyranny are these and this many, for the reasons which I have given. Chapter 11. We have now to inquire what is the best constitution for most states, and the best life for most men, neither assuming a standard of virtue which is above ordinary persons, nor an education which is exceptionally favored by nature and circumstances, nor yet an ideal state which is an aspiration only, but having regard to the life in which the majority are able to share, and to the form of government which states in general can attain. If it was truly said in the Ethics that the happy life is the life according to unimpeded virtue, and that virtue is a mean, then the life which is a mean, and a mean attainable by everyone, must be the best. And the same principles of virtue and vice are characteristic of cities and of constitutions. For the constitution is in pattern the life of the city. Now within all states there are three elements. One class is very rich, another very poor, and a third in the mean. It is admitted that moderation and the mean are the best, and therefore it will clearly be best to possess the gifts of fortune in moderation, for in that condition of life men are most ready to listen to reason. But he who greatly excels in beauty, strength, birth, or wealth, or on the other hand who is very poor, or very weak, or very much disgraced, finds it difficult to follow reason. Of these two kinds, the former grow into violent and great criminals, the latter into rogues and pretty rascals, and two sorts of offenses correspond to them, the one committed by violence, the other by roguery. Moreover, the middle class is least willing to hold office or over-eager for it, both of which dispositions are injurious to the state. But those who have too much of the goods of fortune, strength, wealth, friends, and the like, are neither willing nor able to submit to authority. The evil begins at home, for when they are boys, by reason of the luxury in which they are brought up, they never learn, even at school, the habit of obedience. On the other hand, the very poor, who are in the opposite extreme, are too degraded, so that the one class cannot obey, and can only rule despotically. The other knows not how to command, and must be ruled like slaves. Thus arises a city not of free men, but of masters and slaves, the one despising, the other envying. Nothing can be more fatal to friendship and good fellowship in states than this, for good fellowship starts from friendship, when men are at enmity with one another. They would rather not even share the same path. But a city ought to be composed, as far as possible, of equals and similars, and these are generally the middle classes. Wherefore a city which is composed of middle-class citizens is necessarily best constituted, as far as what we call the natural elements of a state, and this class of citizens is most secure in a state. For they do not, like the poor, covet their neighbor's goods, nor do others covet theirs. As the poor covet the goods of the rich, so as they neither plot against others, nor are themselves plotted against, they pass through life safely. Wisely then did Phoclytes pray, many things are best in the mean. I desire to be of a middle condition in my city. Thus it is manifest that the best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class, and that those states are likely to be well administered in which the middle class is large, and if possible larger than both the other classes, or at any rate than either singly. For the addition of the middle class then turns the scale and prevents either of the extremes from being dominant. Great, then, is the good fortune of a state in which the citizens have a moderate and sufficient property. For where some possess much and the rest nothing, there may arise an extreme democracy, or a pure oligarchy, or a tyranny may grow out of either extreme, out of either the most rampant democracy or out of an oligarchy. But it is not so likely to arise out of a middle and nearly equal condition. I will explain the reason for this hereafter when I speak of the revolutions of states. The mean condition of states is clearly best, since none is free from faction, but where the middle class is large, there are least likely to be factions and dissensions. For a similar reason, large states are less liable to faction than small ones, because in them the middle class is large, whereas in small states it is easy to divide all the citizens into two classes, who are either rich or poor, and to leave nothing in the middle. Democracies are safer too and more permanent than oligarchies, because they have a middle class which is more numerous and has a greater share in the government. For when there is no middle class and the poor greatly exceed in number, troubles arise and the state soon comes to an end. A proof of the superiority of the middle class is that the best legislators have come from the middle rank. For example, Solon, as his own verses testify, and Lycurgus, for he was not a king, and Charondas, and almost all lawmakers. What, then, is the best form of government, and what makes it best is evident. Of other states, since we say there are many kinds of democracy and of oligarchy, it is not difficult to see which has the first, and which the second, or any other place in the order of excellence, now that we have determined which is best. For that which is nearest to the best must of necessity be the better, and that which is furthest from it is worst, if we are judging absolutely and not with reference to given conditions. I say, with reference to given conditions, since a particular government may be preferable in general, but another form may be better for some people. Chapter 12. We have now to consider what and what kind of government is suited to what and what kind of men. I may begin by assuming, as a general principle common to all governments, that element in a state which desires its permanence should be stronger than that which desires the reverse. Now every city is composed of quality and quantity. By quality I mean freedom, wealth, education, good birth, and by quantity I mean superiority of numbers. Quality may exist in one of the classes which make up a state, and quantity in another. For example, the meanly born may be more numerous than the well-born, or the poor than the rich, yet they may not so much exceed in quantity as they fall short in quality. Where the number of the poor is proportionately greater than the wealth of the rich, there will naturally be a democracy, varying in the form with the sort of people who compose it in each case. If, for example, the farmers preponderate in numbers, the first form of democracy will arise. If the artisans and laboring class, the last, and so with the intermediate forms. But where the rich and the notables exceed in quality more than they fall short in quantity, their oligarchy arises, likewise assuming various forms according to the kind of superiority possessed by the oligarchs. Now a lawgiver should always include the middle class in his government, if he makes his laws oligarchic. To the middle class, let him look, if he makes them democratic. He should equally try by his laws to attach this class to the state. Only there can can the government ever be stable where the middle class exceeds one or both of the others, since in that case there will be no fear that the rich will unite with the poor against the rulers, for neither of those classes will ever be willing to serve the other. Though they look for some form of government more congenial to them both, they will find none better than this. For the rich and the poor will never consent to rule by turns because they mistrust one another. The arbiter is always the one trusted, and the one in the middle is the arbiter. The more perfect the mixture of the political elements, the more lasting will be the state. Many of those who desire to form aristocratic governments make a mistake, not only in giving too much power to the rich, but in attempting to overreach the people. Chapter 13. In democracies, they have counter devices. They pay the poor for attending assemblies and the law courts, and inflict no penalty on the rich for non-attendance. It is obvious that he who would duly mix the two principles should combine both practices, and provide that the poor should be paid to attend, and the rich fined if they do not attend. For then all will take part. If there is no such combination, power will be in the hands of one party only. The government should be confined to those who carry arms. As to a property qualification, no absolute rule can be laid down, but we must see what is the highest qualification sufficiently comprehensive to ensure that the number of those who have citizenship rights exceeds the number of those excluded. Still, even if they have no share in office, the poor, provided only that they are not outraged or deprived of their property, will be quiet enough. But to secure gentle treatment for the poor is not an easy thing, since a ruling class is not always humane, and in time of war the poor are apt to hesitate unless they are fed. When fed, they are willing enough to fight. In some states, the government is vested not only in those who are actually serving in the army, but also in those who have served. Among the Malians, for example, the governing body consisted of the latter, while the magistrates were chosen from those actually on service. And the earliest government which arose among the Greeks, after the overthrow of the kingly power, grew up out of the warrior class and was originally taken from the knights. For strength and superiority in war at that time depended on cavalry. For without discipline, infantry are useless, and in ancient times there was no military knowledge or tactics, and therefore the strength of armies lay in their cavalry. But when cities increased and the heavy armed infantry grew in strength, more men had a share in government. This is the reason why the states, which we call constitutional governments, were heretofore called democracies. Ancient constitutions, as might be expected, were oligarchic and royal. Their population being small, they had no considerable middle class. The people were weak in numbers and organization, and were therefore more contented to be governed. I have explained why there are various forms of government, and why there are more than is generally supposed. Democracy as well as other constitutions having more than one form. I have told also what their differences are, and whence they arise, and what is the best form of government speaking generally, and to whom the various forms of government are best suited. All this has now been explained. Chapter 14. Having thus gained an adequate basis for discussion, we will proceed to speak of the points which follow next in order. We will consider the subject not only in general, but with reference to particular constitutions. All contain three elements, and a good lawmaker has to regard what is expedient for each, when they are well ordered. The Constitution is well ordered, and as they differ from one another, the constitutions differ. There is first one, the organ which deliberates about public affairs. Secondly, two, the system of magistrates determining what they should be, over what they should exercise authority, and what should be the mode of electing them. And thirdly, three, the judicial power. The deliberative element has authority in matters of war and peace, in making and unmaking alliances. It passes laws, inflicts death, exile, confiscation, elects magistrates, and audits their accounts. These powers must be assigned either to all the citizens or to some of them, for example, to one or more magistrates, or different ones to different magistrates, or some of them to all, and others of them to some only. That all things should be decided by all is characteristic of democracy. It is the sort of equality which the people desire, but there are various ways in which all may share in government. They may deliberate, not all in one body, but by turns, as in the constitution of Telicles the Milesian. In In other states, the boards of magistrates meet and deliberate. They come into office by turns and are elected out of the tribes and the smallest divisions of the state, until everyone has held office in turn. The citizens, as a body, on the other hand, are assembled only for the purposes of legislation, and to consult about the constitution, and to hear the edicts of the magistrates. A fourth form of democracy is when all citizens meet to deliberate about everything, and the magistrates decide nothing, but making only the preliminary inquiries. That is the way in which the last and worst form of democracy, corresponding, as we said, to a close family oligarchy or a tyranny, is administered. All these methods are democratic. On the other hand, for once grouped to deliberate about everything is oligarchic. This again is a method which, like the democratic, has many forms, when the deliberative class is constituted of those who have a moderate property qualification, and so is numerous, and they respect and obey the law without altering it, and anyone who has the required qualification shares in the government then. Because of their moderation, the oligarchy tends towards a constitutional government. But when only selected individuals and not the people as a whole share in the deliberations of the state, then even though, as in the former case, they observe the law, the government is a pure oligarchy. These, then, are our conclusions respecting the deliberative, that is, the supreme element in states. Chapter 15. Next, we will proceed to consider the distribution of executive offices, this too being a matter of politics over which many questions arise. What shall their number be? Of what shall they have charge, and what shall be their duration? Sometimes they last for 6 months, sometimes for less, sometimes they are annual, whilst in other cases offices are held for still longer periods. Shall they be for life or for a long term of years? Or, if for a short term only, shall the same persons hold them over and over again, or once only? Also about the elections to them, from whom are officials to be chosen, by whom, and how? We should first attempt to say what are the possible kinds of offices, and then we may proceed to determine which are suited to the different forms of government. Then what are to be included under the term offices? That is a question not so easily answered, for a political community requires many officers. And not everyone who is chosen by vote or by lot is to be regarded as a ruler. In the first place, there are the priests, who must be distinguished from political officers, as are the masters of choruses and heralds and ambassadors. Even though they are elected by vote, some duties of superintendence again are political, covering either all the citizens in the single type of action, like the office of the general who superintends them when they are in the field, or only a section of them, like the inspectorships of women or of youth. But other officers deal with household economy, like that of the corn measurers who exist in many states and are elected officers. There are also menial offices which the rich have executed by their slaves. Speaking generally, those are offices of state to which are assigned the duties of deciding about certain measures and of judging and commanding, especially the last, for to command is the especial duty of a magistrate. But the question is of no practical importance. No one has ever brought into court the meaning of the word. No one has ever brought into the court the meaning of the word, although such problems have a speculative interest. What kinds of offices and how many are necessary to the existence of a state, and which, though not necessary, yet conduce to its well-being, are much more important considerations, for they affect all states, but especially small ones. For in great states it is possible and indeed necessary that every function should have its special official. Where the citizens are numerous, many may hold office, and so it happens that some offices can be held a second time only after a long interval, or else held once only. Certainly every work is better done which receives the sole, not the divided, attention of the worker. But in small states it is necessary to combine many offices in a few hands, since the small number of citizens does not admit of many holding office. For who will there be to succeed them? And yet small states at times need the same offices and laws as large ones. The difference is that the latter want them often, the former only after long intervals. There is then no reason why the care of many offices should not be imposed on one person, for they will not interfere with each other. When the population is small, offices should be like the roasting spits which also serve to hold a lamp. So we must first ascertain how many magistrates are necessary in every state, and also how many are not exactly necessary, but are nevertheless useful. And then there will be no difficulty in judging what offices can be combined in one. We should also know over which matters local tribunals are to have jurisdiction and when authority should be centralized. For example, should one person keep order in the market and another in some other place, or should the same person be responsible everywhere? Again, should offices be divided according to the subjects with which they deal, or according to the persons with whom they deal? I mean to say, should one person see to good order in general, or one look after the boys, another after the women, and so on? Further, under different constitutions, should the magistrates be the same or different? For example, in democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, monarchy, should there be the same magistrates, although they are elected not out of equal or similar classes of citizens, but differently under different constitutions? In aristocracies, for example, they are chosen from the educated, in oligarchies from the wealthy, and in democracies from the free. Or are there different offices proper to different constitutions? And may the same be suitable to some but unsuitable to others? For in some states it may be convenient that the same office should have a more extensive, in other states a narrower sphere. A magistracy which controls the boys or the women or any similar office is suited to an aristocracy rather than to a democracy. For how can magistrates prevent the wives of the poor from going out of doors? Neither is it an oligarchic office, for the wives of the oligarchs are too fine to be controlled. Enough of these matters. I will now inquire into the elections to offices. There are three questions to be answered, and the combinations of answers give all possible differences. First, who elects? Secondly, from whom? And thirdly, how? Each of the three answers may also differ in several ways. 1. All the citizens or only some may elect. 2. The magistrates are chosen either from all the people or from some who are distinguished either by a property qualification or by birth or merit, or for some special reason, as at Megara, only those were eligible who had returned from exile and fought together against the democracy. 3. They may be chosen either by vote or by lot. Again, these several variations may be combined. I mean that some officers may be elected by some, others by all, and some again from some group, and others from all the people, and some by vote, and others by lot. There are the different ways of constituting magistrates, and they correspond to the different forms of government, which are proper to which, and how they ought to be established, will be evident when we determine the nature of their powers. By powers, I mean such power as a magistrate exercises over the revenue or in defense of the country, for there are various kinds of power. The power of a general, for example, is not the same as that which governs contracts in a market. Chapter 16. Of the three parts of government, the judicial remains to be considered, and this we shall analyze on the same principle. There are 3 points on which the variations in law courts depend, namely the persons from whom the judges are appointed, the matters with which they are concerned, and the manner of their appointment. 1. Are the judges taken from all the people or from some only? 2. How many kinds of law courts are there? And 3. Are the judges chosen by vote or by lot? First, let me determine how many kinds of law courts there are. They are 8 in number. One is the court of audits or scrutinies. The second takes cognizance of offenses against the state. The third is concerned with treason against the Constitution. The fourth decides disputes respecting penalties, whether raised by magistrates or by private persons. The fifth decides the more important civil cases. The sixth tries cases of homicide, which are of various kinds. 1. Premeditated. 2. Unpremeditated. 3. Cases in which guilt is confessed but the justice is disputed, and there may be a fourth court. 4. In which murderers who have fled from justice are tried after their return, such as the court of Phraeato is said to have been at Athens. But cases of this sort rarely happen at all, even in large cities. The different kinds of homicide may be tried either by the same or by different courts. And 7. There are courts for foreigners. And of these there are two subdivisions: for the settlement of their disputes with one another, and for the settlement of disputes between them and the citizens. Besides all these, there must be 8 courts for petty suits about sums of a drachma, up to 5 drachmas, or a little more. These have to be settled, but do not require many judges. Now, if all citizens serve as judges in all the different cases which I have distinguished, they may be appointed by vote or by lot, or sometimes by lot and sometimes by vote. Again, the modes of election may be combined. I mean that some may be chosen out of the whole people, others out of some out of both. For example, the same tribunal may be composed of some who were elected from all the people and of others who were elected from a group, either by vote or by lot of both, or by lot or both. In how many forms law courts can be established has now been considered. The first form, that in which the judges are taken from all the citizens, and in which all cases are tried, is democratic. The second, in which only a few judges try all the cases, is oligarchic. And the third, in which some judges are taken from all classes, and some from certain classes only, is aristocratic and constitutional. That is the end of Book 4.